So first, thank you all for joining us for this webinar today. We're going to talk about infectious disease models. And I know obviously with the current COVID-19 pandemic, it just seemed like a good topic that people might not know about it being included in TreeAge Pro. Now, I do not want to be representing myself as having any specific knowledge about COVID or any any values in the model that are specific to that. This is really just demonstrating some of the techniques you could use for infectious disease models that might be useful in this kind of case. But I don't ever want anyone using my models as being kind of real models. They're almost always training models. So we'll go ahead and get started with the details. We're going to use this model right here, this infectious disease webinar daily SIR model, as kind of to illustrate these points about the infectious disease tools in TreeAge Pro. It's a pretty standard Markov model. I know some of you may not have a lot of experience with TreeAge Pro, but what Markov models in TreeAge Pro start with a Markov node, which just starts the Markov process, and then this first generation of nodes off the Markov node are your health states. Now, this one isn't a real health state. We'll talk about that in a little while, but these definitely are real health states, and it's following the standard SIR, infected, uninfected or susceptible, infected and recovered, and we're presuming immunity. Those are the states, and then of course people could die. We'll talk about this later in terms of what that is doing, but I just wanted to give you a little brief for people not familiar with TreeAge Pro, what's happening. Now, from these states, you have pathways. So an uninfected person could become infected, could continue in an uninfected state, or could die. It wouldn't be from the disease, it would be from something else, but they could die. And for infected, they could recover, continue, or die. And then the immune people are not going to get disease because they've had it, but they could die. And this comprises a standard Markov model within TreeAge Pro. But we're going to focus on a couple of elements that are specific to this kind of model that you may not have used in the past. One of those things is this probability of infection. This is a critical piece in infectious disease models that's very different from your standard treatment-based model. I mean, if you're treating cancer or something like that, you're not really worried about that cancer passing to another person. So you don't have any kind of interaction amongst the people in the cohort. That's not true in an infectious disease model. That probability of infection is calculated using the proportion that's already infected in that kind of pandemic mechanism that these infections can grow and become more likely as you get more infected people in the overall cohort. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time focusing on this probability right here. The other part that's kind of unique to this kind of model is the concept of a dynamic cohort. So in typical TreeAge Pro Markov models, when you're studying treatment, like a cancer treatment, you can really think of it as a cohort of one and get all your values back related to what it costs to treat an average person and how long we can expect them to live as measured in qualities. That's not the case for this kind of model. In this kind of model, we need to have a cohort of a certain size, and we need that cohort to be able to change, or the cohort size to be able to change. And we'll introduce elements into this model, or we'll examine elements in this model that help make that happen. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into some of the details. And I want to start, and let me just see if there's any questions before I continue in the chat. Okay, no questions so far, so we'll go ahead and continue. So let's focus on this probability of infection and what makes this kind of unique to an infectious disease model. And if we look at the variable for the probability of infection, and you may not know that there's a little filter here, so I can type in PRO, and it will kind of focus on just the variables that start with prob. And I'm really interested in this one, this probability of infection. And let's look at the formula here. And the formula here, now it starts with a rate. So I have this rate to prob. This rate to prob actually converts a rate to a probability. That's not really unique to this kind of model. What's really important to this kind of model is this proportion infected, this element right here. The rate to prob is just taking that rate and applying it to my daily cycle. This rate infection is a function of the contagious nature of the disease. Now, I don't know what that rate is for COVID or any other any disease. I just made one up to illustrate the point. But the overall arching point I'm trying to make is the probability of infection is related to both a rate related to the contagious nature of the disease and the proportion of people already infected. And that's how you end up with these spikes in infection, where once you get a few, then they infect more people, and you end up with a significant rise in cases. So let's look even deeper at this probability of infection. Well, how is that calculated? Well, let's go back here and look for proportion infected. And it's calculated as the count of the people infected. That's the people in this state divided by the total count of people who are alive, which includes uninfected, infected, and recovered. So it's the percentage in this state related to the total percentage of people in all the non-dead states. So we're going to use that to drive the probability of infection, and that creates that kind of acceleration in cases. Let me just check for questions real quick. I'm going to try to keep checking for questions occasionally, and no questions so far. Great. So let's look a little deeper at this, because this doesn't really tell you anything. Well, where did count? I mean, it tells you what we're trying to do, but it doesn't give you the details of how to do it. How do we get the count infected, and how do we get the count alive? So I'm going to clear this filter, and I'm going to just do a new filter for the for the 3 counts. And you see what they do is they use this state prob function, and this is built into the software. And state prob 3 gives you the count, or in a typical cohort model, a percentage, but in this case, it'll be a count of people in the 3rd state. I know this isn't a real state, but it's still a branch. 1, 2, 3. So state prob 3 gives you the count of infected people, whereas the state prob 2 and 4 gives you the percentage uninfected and the count of people who are immune. And if you add them all together, you get the count alive. So count alive is the sum of all the people in these 3 states. Count infected is the people in this state. You take that one divided by the other, and now you have a percentage alive. Percentage infected, which again feeds back into the probability of infection, this proportion infected. So again, this proportion affected is the count of people in here divided by the count of the people in all 3. And that's how this thing is going to begin to spread with increasing acceleration. Let me see if there's any questions. I'm going to just go back to the chat window. I'm going to mute because we need to mute again, and see if there's any questions. Can I enlarge the screen? I really can't make it any bigger than it is. I'm sorry, Rui. This is in order to show you everything. This is what I've got to do. So I apologize if it's a little bit small. How did I define the variables I just mentioned? They're just regular variables. You just create a plus. You just create a new variable. So let's just say I wanted the count infected. I'd say count infect. I'm going to call it 2 because that one exists, and I would use the state prob function and the 3rd state. So it's just a regular variable. It's just using this special function within software you might not have known about to count the people in that state. So there's nothing special about this variables other than the use of this function itself. And if you're wondering about functions, there are lots and lots of functions in TreeAge Pro, and they're all described in the health. So here's state prob, if I go into state prob, it tells you actually what it does here in the function helper, and it would tell you in help if you just did a search on what does state prob do. So anyway, I don't need to do that. It's already in the model. Let's continue with the next section that we did. So I'm going to close the chat, and I'm going to go back into the model, and we'll talk about the next kind of infectious disease specific element of that model, and that's the size of the cohort. So what we have here is we have a starting point for people in these states, and we're also adding more people into the cohort with time. And this is not typical for most treatment-based models. It's something a little different, but there's a couple of things that you have to do to make that happen. The first is starting with with people in those states. I'm just going to minimize this. And in order to do that, I have to break one of the rules in TreeAge Pro. And one of those rules is that chance nodes and Markov nodes expect the probabilities to the right of them to sum to 1. Well, in this case, we want to override that rule. So the way I did that was right clicking on this, and you could do this on a chance node too, and change the coherence. And you notice I have it set to allow this to not be 100%. Typically, it would just use whatever's true for the whole tree, which is they all have to be coherent 100%. But by specifically selecting this option, now I can actually have counts related to the people in these 3 states. And let's look at those counts, my variables. I just started them all with n, so I can easily get to them. N initial, and you see I'm starting with a total population of 1 million people, a number of infected people of 1,000 people, and then the uninfected is just anyone who's left. So it'll be 900, or 1,000 people infected, and the rest of the 1 million people will be uninfected. And that's my starting point. And obviously, you could change this to whatever you want. I just set these particular initial values to illustrate this point and to use this as a teaching tool. Now, that's one element. So when I run the cohort analysis, I'm going to see 1,000 people here and 1 million minus 1,000 people here. In addition to that, I also want to be able to add people to the cohort. And that's what this entry node, you see the little arrow there, that's an entry node. And that tells the Markov process that this isn't really a state. It's just a mechanism to add new people into the model. And so I'm adding this many new infected people to the model, uninfected, excuse me, and this many new infected. And if I look at the N add, you see I add 10 new infected and 20 new uninfected into the model each day. I have a daily cycle in this model. And of course, you could change these to whatever you want. I just used nice, simple, round numbers for us to start with. So we've looked at the 2 key elements to this model. The probability of infection is one. The changing the setting of the cohort size and changing that cohort size is the second. And now I think we're ready to actually run the model. Now, I do want to look at one more thing, the model outcomes. So if I go into the tree preferences and look at my payoffs, I have 2 enabled payoffs. This isn't a cost effectiveness model, it's just 2 payoffs, and I'm counting current cases and total cases over time. So those are the 2 outcomes I'm generating from this particular model. And if I look at the Markov cohort, Markov info view, at the Markov node, I can see how they are being updated. So here's my, the first one is the total cases, excuse me, the current cases, and the next one is the total cases. So because infected is a case, I need to update that by 1 for the people who come in infected already. And then as time goes by and events occur, see here the new people coming in, that's another case that I have to add. And then when uninfected people become infected, that's another case I have to add. And when infected people either recover or die, I'm going to use that to reduce the number of current cases, but I'm not going to reduce the number of total cases because that's a cumulative. I don't want that to go down. So I'm tracking current cases and total cases in the model, both through as people enter the model and as they develop or resolve infections. So those are my primary outcomes in this model. So I just wanted to show you how those were being counted before I run the model. And now it's time to run the model. So I'm going to go to the Markov info view, and I'm going to run the Markov cohort extended analysis, which is this one. And this is a daily cycle, so I ran for 700 days or something like that. And now you see your breakdown. There were 1,000 cases, and the other 999,000 were uninfected. Now, that's not the end of it. Some of those uninfected people became infected. A few died. From the uninfected, some of them recovered. Very few died, and many continued in that infected state. And so that's going to change with time, and you're going to see the infections rise and then drop. And let's look a little bit closer at that. right? So we had about 5 new cases come in the first cycle, and then the next cycle you're going to see 89 or 90 infections, and that's going to start to rise. If we slide down a little bit further and go further down, and we start to see continuous kind of increase or acceleration in the cases, we're going to see a lot more. So if I go down to, let's say, day 35, just at random, I'm picking day 35, and if I look at day 35, right, there are already 14,672 cases. Now you can ignore these fractions of people. It's running as cohort analysis, so these become fractions. You could round this up to 14,672 infections. So that number of infections has gone way up from the original 1,000. Okay. Meanwhile, on that day, we get another 1,186 infections. So we're getting a lot of infections now that this thing is accelerated up towards its peak. So you see that the dynamics of the cohort and the population dynamics of way this disease is spreading through the overall population is causing this, is seeing that pandemic curve. So let's look a little bit deeper at the curve, because it's hard to see all the numbers or all the impact of what's going on just by looking at the numbers. It's easier to see if we look at it graphically. So I'm going to open this graph here, and here we see the uninfected people dropping, this infection kind of slowly rising, and then you get the acceleration when it starts to peak. And when people talk about flattening the curve, they're talking about trying to prevent this peak from getting too high and overloading the health system. So ideally, we would spread that out over time, and eventually we'd go through much of the population. But in this model, it's very pessimistic. We just have this big spike in about 120, 130 days, to which we have about 750,000 cases. I don't mean to scare anyone. I just put this together, and this is what I got. Um, so you see it's rising. It accelerates a lot. It's going way up, and then around day 130, it peaks out, and then it starts to drop as people resolve their infections and you see this recovered immune starts to go up until it's almost everyone. And ideally someday we'll get out here and we'll be here where everyone's immune or vaccinated or whatever it takes. But that's not where we are right now. Let me see if there's any questions before I continue. Okay, so there's a couple questions here, quite a few. So I'm going to take a little break from the presentation and try to get to these questions. Okay, is the changing coherence the reason for the red flag over the nodes? Yes, that is true. That is why you see these red flags. That is just a warning when you look at the model, and if you sent it to someone else, that there's something special about this node, and specifically it is the non-coherence. So good question there. I'm just reading these questions. The probability of getting infection may be different with the infected population size and how we keep changing the probability instead of having constant probability. Yes, I agree with that. There are two kind of elements here. One is the rate and one is the proportion infected. We can't control the proportion infected. That's kind of happening as the disease progresses. We may be able to do things to control the rate. And I'm going to get to that in a little while. But if we, let's say through mitigating actions and stay home order type things can slow the rate, that is a major factor that I will try to return to. So that's a really good question. It's a lot of questions. I may not get through all of them. Okay. Choosing the non-coherence. The entry node will default to being non-coherent. The Markov node will not. So you'd have to change the Markov node to make it non-coherent, whereas the entry node will default to that. What is the reason for allowing the probability to be over 1? Because we want to study the population dynamics across the whole population, and we want that to be able to make that change. So we're specifically choosing to study population dynamics rather than a cohort of size 1. Can I check how the rate to prob function works? So the rate to prob function just takes a rate and converts it to a probability. I don't want to spend too much time on that specific question right now, but the rate basically has no time period. The probability does. So when you take the kind of timeless rate and apply it, change it to a probability, it asks you what's the time period over which you want this probability calculated. feel free to contact me afterwards if that's not enough for what you need. Um, Let me see the next one. Can you put a reinfection state from the recovery state? Absolutely, you could. I'm choosing to hope that people become immune, but you absolutely, if the immunity didn't last or you couldn't count on immune, you could have another node here where people return to the infected state. But that's just not part of this particular example model. Let's see. Could you add cost and effects? Absolutely, you could have costs and effectiveness in this model. I'm choosing to handle this to track infections, current and total, but you absolutely could have additional payoffs in the model for cost effectiveness. Um, is it possible to have a graph of the probability of infection versus time? Uh, Potentially, it's not built into this model right now. I'd have to think about how to get to record that. I know I could do it. I just don't know how fancy I'd have to get. I might have to store that in a global matrix or some kind of additional piece of information beyond the payoffs because it really applies to everyone, not the individuals, and it's not affected by the cohort. Excuse me. It is affected by the cohort percentage infected, but it's not. I don't want it multiplied by that. I want it recorded and reported separately. I'd have to think about that one. Is in the results shown, total number of persons remained 1 million. Why do I add people? Um, you would add people, like, for example, if you, let's say you were doing the state of Vermont and not state of New York. Well, some of your infections may be coming from people who live out of state and they're coming into the state. So that would be adding to your cohort of people. So there will be times when you want to do that, where you want the cohort size to change. You don't have to do that. I'm not trying to force you. If it doesn't apply in your situation, feel free to use a constant cohort size. Okay. A lot of questions here. I'm just trying to get to all of them. Is a dynamic population model with the interaction among people? Yes, that's what this is. It's dynamic. The interaction among people is in this case only right here in the prob infect, but it could be in any other place if you wanted to. And the population dynamics is through these counts and through this entry node. So yes, that is true. Um, can you add the import cases as the new population added? I'm not sure exactly what the question is. I mean, I'm adding them here. They will end up in these states. So they don't become part of the initial count, but they do become part of the current count with time. I'm not sure I answered that perfectly, but that's the best I can do for that. Is it possible to perform sensitivity analysis? Yes, absolutely. This is a calculation of the model. It's difficult to look at sensitivity analysis day by day by day, but you could look at the total infections over time, as parameters change. So absolutely, you could build sensitivity analysis on top of this. The question is, can you develop like a single outcome that captures what you want, or would you be better off manually changing the some of the inputs and rerunning the whole curve so you can see not just a total output, but an output over time? So that's a little bit of a tricky question. I don't want to dig too deep into that, but hopefully you understand the subtlety of the difference between having a solid single outcome versus over time. And I think in this case, we're really interested over time. So we'd want to kind of look at that pretty carefully. Um, can we add a formula for the aim of the curve, including logarithmic? Um, yes, I mean you could definitely have these probabilities not be fixed. It could be Weibels and things like that. I don't want to make it any more complicated than it is already with the probability of infection, but you can make any of these formulas more complicated for sure. And then this is the last question so far, for increasing the patient number in dynamic model. Oh, it's part of the last question. Yes, you could have any of these formulas, including these count adds, not be fixed. Anything could be not fixed. This can't be not fixed because it's only used once, but certainly these could be. Okay, that's it for the questions for now. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. Where we ended off was here with our state prop showing this spike infection where it reaches its peak around day 130 and then drops down. So by the end of, in this case, 2 years of days, most people have recovered and immune. But I want to look a little bit more at some of the additional outcomes, because here's your state problem. That's very interesting. But I also had a couple of things related to um, new current cases and new cases, and I can see those here. And really, I'm focusing on the current cases. So the current cases, this is the change in cases. You see, it goes up and it spikes around here, around what week 80 or 90, something like that. And then when you get up to that 130 right here, where it's 0, that's where you've peaked, right? Here, you've peaked at 130. That's where you have the maximum number of cases. Well, that's when the rate of cases reaches 0. The change in the number of cases reaches 0. So instead of adding, you're still adding cases. You're adding cases at a faster and faster rate. This is where the acceleration in the number of cases at its highest, the new cases at its highest. Now the current cases is dropping in number, or excuse me, the rate of growth of new cases is dropping. And by the time you get past 0, now the rate of cases has gone negative and you actually have fewer cases. And eventually you get to the point where you're not really changing the number of cases. So this is the change in the number of cases over time. And then this other graph here, cumulative, that's the total number of cases over time. So you see again, it's not that it's it comes up and then it starts to drop. So that's the total cases rise and fall. That's not the rate. I said that a little bit wrong. The last one was the change in the rate of cases. This is the total number of cases, which peaks at the same point as the state prop graph and then drops. And we probably could add some more graphs here that might be helpful. This is what I have to show you today. Now, I want to move on to a couple more things. So scenario testing, and this comes a little bit back to the idea of instead of doing traditional sensitivity analysis, of actually changing some of the assumptions in the model. So I'm going to come back here to the model, and right now I actually already have this set up with a function that you may not know about, but these variable sets. This is a way to change the inputs and store 2 sets of inputs to this model. And specifically, if I change this rate here and I look at the rate, I've changed it. If I go back to the original one, default infection rate, it was just 30. I just set it to a fixed value of 30. And now with this second set of model inputs here, I basically said for the first 60 days it's at 30, and now we've introduced some mitigating actions like asking people to stay at home that has reduced the rate after 60 days. So I know I just made this up, but what it's trying to illustrate is if we take action to reduce the rate, what does it do? So in this case, after 60 days, we drop the rate significantly. So we've got everyone staying home. Now let's see what the model does now. If I rerun the analysis and I look at that state prob curve, and you see here's where the rate changed at 60. So instead of what we had before, which I'm going to show side by side, this one and this one, hopefully you can see them both. And this is if we did nothing and we just let the disease just go and peak out at its own rate. And here's where we introduce some kind of intervention to slow the rate. And you see, what have we done? We flattened the curve, right? And we're not overloading the healthcare system as much as if we just let it spike on its own. And we introduced the intervention here, so it didn't affect what happened until we introduced the intervention, and then it flattened out the curve. Now, it's going to take longer for people to get kind of recovered, but that's good because we slowed out the pace of the infections occurring. And that's basically theoretically what you're doing when you introduce interventions to slow the spread of disease. Okay. I'm going to continue on. I will take more questions. I just want to continue on through what I have to get through today. A couple of things on this model that beyond what I included in this model, and I didn't want to make it too difficult to cover, so I didn't try to make it super fancy. So you see, it was basically the main, uninfected or susceptible, infected and recovered, along with the cohort. There would be other things that you might want to add to this model. So for example, with COVID, there's a lot of people who could be exposed and contagious, but not infected, and they're not showing signs of disease or symptoms. So theoretically, you might build a model more like this SEIR model. And I want to thank Russell for suggesting that I show this. And now we have an additional exposed state where they don't develop the symptoms right away, right? They become exposed and they don't have any symptoms. They may develop symptoms and drop into to infected, but right here they're at danger of infecting other people. So this would just be an extension of the model that I showed with another state to represent that exposed but asymptomatic. And you see, if we ran the cohort analysis on this one, you see here's your exposed and the infected is a little slower. And I didn't do anything to try to make this a realistic model for any disease, but you see another state here, and the infections take longer because not everyone actually gets infected. They could become exposed and move on to recovered without actually experiencing the full infection and the impact of that infection on their own body. But they are potentially harming other people when they're in this state. So that's one thing that you might want to do to add to this model. Another thing you might need to do is think about the impact of different age groups or something like that. So you might have some different states to represent different age groups where your probability of dying from the infection in an older age group could be much, much higher and worse, or somehow break down this cohort into different kind of categories based on their risk factors, because some people are going to be much more um, likely to be badly affected by the infection than others. And I'm not trying to address that in this particular model. And I'm sure there are many, many other things that someone who understands whatever disease it is better than I do would potentially add to the model. But that doesn't take away from what I'm trying to illustrate today. I'm going to go back and try to take some more questions. So I heard it beeping, so I'm pretty sure there are more questions. Nope, no questions. Okay. So anyway, that's all I had for today. I won't close it right away in case some more questions come in. But I hope you found this useful, and I know there are people using the software for COVID models, and maybe there'll be more. And I certainly want to encourage you, if you have a license and are to ask for help if you need some help with any of these techniques. You can email us at support@treeage.com, and we'd be happy to try to assist. If there are no further questions, I'm going to close the session, and within a week or so, we will. I see it was used in Turkey. Thank you for mentioning that. I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope you join us for future webinars, and we will try to get this recording up by the end of the week on the webinars page for any of you or for anyone that you wanted to see it that wasn't able to attend. So anyway, thank you all. I really appreciate your time, and have a great day, and everyone stay safe.